It is Sunday, April 12th, and it's getting pretty late with Jake Landau. Here this week is our regular military and defense analyst, Noah Gairn, and he is here from the True North Strategic Review. And he is here to discuss the impacts of the 2026 Iran war on the military and defense sector, including how it's changing modalities and how it's changing planning both for the United States and for Canada and other militaries around the world who may have to interact with the United States. And it is a pleasure to have Noah back on the show. Noah, welcome.
Thank you for having me for, I believe, the third time now I've been on.
I think third
There's always
time. I believe that is correct. You are appearing for the third time, and yeah, as many people are probably aware, there is currently a war between Iran and the United States and Israel, and this war is has sort of tenuous, but maybe not really ceasefire that's being negotiated. But in the meanwhile, that has raised a lot of questions about the future of how warfare will be conducted by the United States and by people fighting the United States. For the United States, thought that they would be able to completely decapitate the Iranian government and then institute regime change. This did not happen. Iran was able to mount a pretty successful counter offensive, and they've taken a lot of U.S. and Israeli military hardware out of the sky. They've shot down a bunch of Reaper drones, a bunch of Israeli Aton drones. And in terms of manned aircraft, one of the things that struck out to me, aside from stuff like taking out a Stratotanker and stuff, Noah, is that they managed to down an F-35.
that. So with the F-35, what we know right now, and of course, with the one thing about the Iranian war right now is that in certain cases it can be pretty hard to get information on what exactly has happened and the extent of damages in some cases. So with the F-35 hit, there was reportedly a hit. I think it's pretty safe to say that there was a hit. However, as far as I know, it was able to get back to whatever airfield it was coming off
Yeah,
of and
they didn't take it
land.
out. I apologize. They it returned to the airfield, but they were able to hit it, and
They were able to
that's
hit it
and that
and
sort
taking out
of
the involved.
raises questions about the value of the so-called stealth.
Um, for the F-35, it's one of those moments where you're looking at it and it's one of those kind of weird pivotal moments, I guess, when you're kind of sitting there looking at it because, of course, with the F-35, there has been obviously a lot of hype. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about the F-35, and honestly, everyone's going to be really, really excited when one gets hit. It doesn't necessarily surprise me that one got hit. I am going to make the statement, as some might controversially see it, that I would actually expect in a conflict of this nature that you would see something like an F-35 getting hit in this case, because of course, we talk a lot about stealth and we talk a lot about capabilities, but there is always the sense of, it takes one lucky hit, it takes just one lucky situation and one lucky scenario where an aircraft can, even like the aircraft like the F-35, can end up being hit. And of course, with the Iranians, they have a very well developed, very dense air defense network that they've been building out over the last 20, 30, 40 years that, has been designed and tailored to attempting to fight back against the United States Air Force and against the Israeli Air Force. So it doesn't really come as a big shock to me that one did get hit, so in a
So,
sense.
but wait,
I,
then is it a lucky hit, or is it that they have a well-developed air defense system designed to pierce through the stealth?
I think it's both in this case. And that might be a little bit confusing, but let me try and explain a little bit. So the Iranians have been getting hit pretty hard since the beginning of the war. Far more than Midnight Hammer, where they were hit. We've seen the United States, Israel, and select Gulf partners who might not be willing to say that they've been doing attacks inside Iran, but let's be real. They've managed to successfully degrade a lot of the Iranian military capability However, when you have such a well-developed network, it gets very hard to take out everything, if that makes sense. And when you're running a month-long operation where you're, running back and forth, you know, time and time again, it gets fairly easy for situations to develop, if that makes sense, where, the Iranians hypothetically could develop a plan or a pathway of, okay, we know where they're running. Similar to um, back in the Yugoslav wars, if you remember that situation, it's a very similar one where, you're going to run into these situations where you're running ops all the time. The Iranians have been working to develop the plan of how are we going to fight against American and Israeli air power, and they're going to develop the strategies to successfully counter and track where they're going to be. And that's why I kind of say a lucky hit in this case, because in my mind, it probably was a very, very lucky hit where, they were figuring out, okay, this is where they're coming from, this is where they're going, this is the path that they're taking,
So it
this is
wasn't
set
an
up the proper
accident.
system.
You don't mean that it was an accident. You just mean that even when they have all the math and they have the air defense system, that it was hard.
Yes, yes. The F-35 is, in my opinion, I think I've said before, the F-35 is probably the most survivable aircraft that you could throw into a situation like that. It's not just, of course, the stealth and the codings. It's the electronics that are in there. It's the actual systems that are in there. It's the amount of data that the F-35 can push through. It's everything coming together in that case. And of course, whenever something like the F-35 gets hit, it creates a very, very big, what's going on, where did the failings go, what part of it, what part in the chain went wrong for where the F-35 was able to get hit. And of course, with the Iranians, like we say, when you're developing this big air defense network, it gets very, very hard to take out everything. Like if you can go for bombing runs for a whole month, sure, but you're never going to necessarily get everything. And of course, with the Iranians, again, obviously, they've been working on the strategy since Midnight Hammer last year, which I guess you could also say that Midnight Hammer kind of gave them the taste and the experience to better develop the strategies and better develop the concepts of how they were going to defend against a hypothetical Israeli and American bombing campaign.
Right.
So they
So
did
you
they did
in general though, you think that the F-35 here it was more survivable than say an F-15E Strike Eagle would have been.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
The poor Strike Eagle did get shot
Right.
down. Unfortunately, there's one Strike Eagle loss. I remember some people saying there was a second, but I don't think. I think a lot of people are just conflating the first one. I haven't heard of a second. I only know of the one that was shot down. But yes, the F-35 is more survivable than an F-15 in these kinds of areas, which is why, of course, they're employed in these kinds of scenarios, in these kinds of very dense air defense environments, these areas where, you're dealing with robust, very capable air defense network. Of course, I think it can be stated very well that the Iranians have developed a very well coordinated and very well developed air defense network for themselves, not even just backed by, Russian systems like the S-300. They have their own indigenous systems, the Bavar 373 and such, that they've developed over the last decade plus from technologies taken from American and Russian systems. So they have very capable air defense network. And in this case, the F-35 is the aircraft you want to send in there because it is designed to go into these areas and it is designed to be survivable in these areas and strike these assets. However, when we're talking about a conflict like Iran and when we're talking about a conflict like, say, with China in the future, there is a sense of scale where you're not going to get everything in the initial campaign. And
And
that's, of course,
and scale is one of the interesting questions here. And to shift the discussion more generally, like in the question of jets versus drones, Iran has kind of shown with this conflict that with the order of magnitudes that drones are cheaper than humans, human piloted jets, like it does appear that it's hard for the United States to keep supplying jets when they can essentially be swarmed by unmanned drones that are much cheaper for Iran to produce.
I think it highlights a very big problem that a lot of Western militaries still have. Even though we've been seeing a lot of this in Ukraine for the past 4 years, it still calls into question, I think, how a lot of Western militaries are still not really catching up to the counter UAS field, and how we haven't really had a chance to properly develop among ourselves proper counter unmanned aerial capabilities among ourselves. Because, you know, we've seen it for the last couple of years in Ukraine, and this isn't necessarily a shock to anybody how these systems are being employed. The Ukrainians have been dealing with this exact same scenario for 2 or 3 years
Well, Russia's literally
now.
been buying Iranian drones.
So, buying and producing under license and improving upon them with their own technologies. So
Improvements
we're
which I'm sure get shared back with Iran.
Oh, of course. No matter what, you're going to get that nice back and forth of tech transfer and knowledge sharing. That's the part that makes it scary among our adversaries is when they start properly cooperating with each other. But in this case, the United States, and it's funny because even the United States during the Iranian conflict has employed their own one-way attack systems. We have stuff like Lucas, low-cost, uncrewed combat attack system, if I'm remembering it correctly. Lucas is essentially a copy of the Iranian Shaheed. Oh gosh, which one is it? The 136. I have to remember because there's an entire family of Shaheed drones and they're all different from each other, but it's the 136. It's essentially a copy of the Shaheed 136. And it's been employed very well, and it's a well-loved systems by all accounts during the conflict. So it's kind of funny how you have two opposite sides essentially using a very similarly designed one-way attack drone against each other in this conflict. But when it comes to the United States, and even when it comes to us, when we're talking about ourselves, we haven't really developed the technologies to properly counter the drone threat. We've kind of developed ad hoc capabilities for a lot of us, where we're kind of like, okay, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do a little bit of this, we're going to try a little bit of that, but nobody, I'd say, in the West, outside the Ukrainians, has really developed a proper layered counter UAS network. And for me, unmanned aerial systems are probably one of the threats that for Canada it becomes extremely serious because it is a accessible, it's an affordable, and it is a
Right.
highly scalable
And for
system that
context, what you call one-way attack drones, I more bluntly call them kamikaze drones because,
kamikaze drone. Yep.
like a kamikaze pilot, the job is literally just to be cheap enough to fly into the target. But unlike a kamikaze pilot, it's actually ethical because there's no human on board.
And what's also funny about a lot of one-way attack drones is that they also are ISR platforms in themselves. They're not just go flying in a direction to go hit something. They're collecting data. They're collecting information about themselves. So anytime those drones are passing by, they're relaying information. They're capturing information. They're not just essentially just flying bombs.
Right.
They are networked. They are data-driven platforms, which makes them in many
Well,
cases even
they navigate using a GNSS system. In the West, it's usually GPS, and in Russia or in Iran, it would probably be GLONASS. And that comes to my other question. And wouldn't the main way of counter UAV or counter drone warfare be just electronic jamming?
electronic jamming can work in a lot of cases. It really depends because we've seen the electronic game in Ukraine for the last 2 or 3 years, and the Russians and Ukrainians have gotten very, very well at adapting to different electronic attack methods, as well as jamming of specific, satellite constellations and whatnot. Um, Also, of course, if you want to get down a bit smaller scale than these drones, if we're getting into the, kind of FPV style, there's also a whole cache of other systems. Fiber optic guided drones are now pretty prevalent in Ukraine,
Yeah,
and they're
fiber
going.
optic guided drones are one thing where, like, in a
They're
shorter range, obviously, you can have
for
it has wired internet, essentially, the drones, so it can't be jammed.
and
But
when we
in terms of these longer range UAVs, a wire isn't really an option.
no, with these you're looking. Electronic attack works so long as your adversary doesn't adapt your attack methods and adapts to them, which is why we also see, of course, and of course, even with electronic warfare, there's always going to be chances of systems passing through, which is why when we talk about CUAS, we tend to think of it as a kinetic and non-kinetic spectrum, where you have a non-kinetic systems, whether that is RF jamming, whether that's electronic warfare, whichever you want to do. That is your non-kinetic layer, and then of course you have the kinetic layer. That is your missiles. That is your
Right.
gun-based systems. Even other drones these days are counter unmanned systems in their own right. We have interceptor drones now that essentially just
But
ram
again,
right.
like I guess what my question is, and like focusing in on that non-kinetic, that RF jamming, like I guess my confusion here, Noah, is could you not just completely jam the electromagnetic spectrum in an area? And I mean, yes, you would completely block off things like radio and Wi-Fi and cellular networks, and it would be like back to the 1800s, but nonetheless, like, I don't understand why that can't completely preclude drones in a sense.
It really depends on the internal guidance system of the drones. Some drones don't operate anymore necessarily on the electromagnetic spectrum. Certainly, you could, if you wanted to just like bomb the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and you just wanted to like, go full, just everybody fucking loses. In that case, we all fucking go down with ship. Then certainly you could do that.
I mean, like, in
But
a case like Ukraine and Russia, where like drone warfare is so utterly prevalent, like it does raise the question: at what point does one of them bite the bullet and say everyone has to use hardwired internet and there's no Wi-Fi in this like 10-kilometer block of the legislature? You get what I mean?
I get what you mean. And of course, electronic warfare is complicated. It's very power intensive. It is very, it's not a cheap system to run. Of course, when you're dealing with things like satellite jamming, especially, it gets extremely, extremely complicated and very, very technical. You hypothetically could, in a sense, just, completely degrade the electronic spectrum of an area. But
That's
like you said,
essentially
there
what I mean, and not to give myself away as too much of a nerd, but like what one of the anime I like is Gundam, and the whole premise is that jets have kind of died as a modality because they figured out how to create a nuclear fusion engine, but it just pollutes the electromagnetic spectrum, so there's like no radar, no sonar. You essentially can only conduct warfare by like visual line of sight. And like stuff like the fiber optic guided drones in Ukraine, that kind of made me think of like real life following art and fiction, because like that is how they get past that. They use like wire guided drones in space.
and and it's like when you're talking, especially about electronic jamming. We're talking about like really powerful, really fucking like power intensive,
Right.
hardware intensive systems. If you want to do the entire electromagnetic spectrum, which in cases are also going to be lighting up like a Christmas tree as a target for your
Of
adversary
course,
with
but like
anything.
that's
It
why I mean, like, you could impose it around like the primary core of like the government district and like the national capital. Yeah, especially because it's like you're right, the energy demands would be high, but surely, like, for such an institution, like generators and power delivery can be arranged in a more special way than in regard to normal civilian infrastructure.
Mhm. It becomes a real and like anything in like the electronic game is extreme. It's very technical and it's very very difficult to get exactly what you want. Because again, like when we're talking about electronic warfare, we're talking about a whole different levels of frequencies, and we're talking about an entire different spectrum of things. And of course, that's not even counting, again, like the natural limitations. I do get what you mean though about just let's reset everybody back to the to the pre World War II era,
I
and just everybody goes
I
back.
mean, as long as like the infrastructure, the thing is, the RF interference could even interfere with wired internet to an extent, unless those cables are like shielded. So there would be like a lot of economic impact depending on how wide of an area you want to impose it on. But I could totally see it making sense for, like, say, around Parliament Hill, for example, in Canada, imposing, like, on, you get what I mean, like, at least to prevent any kind of such attack, like, on the base of government operations.
And we do, and we are having those conversations, albeit like very, very slowly and very, very, I'm going to say, not to the extent that we need to have them. We are having those kinds of conversations about, like what do we actually need to protect the infrastructure again, especially when we're talking about like drones, which are, of course, obviously nobody, if you remember last year, maybe it was, I think it was, yeah, last year, obviously with Operation Spiderweb, Ukrainians pulling off a wonderful coordinated attack primarily through cheap, small unmanned systems against Russia's strategic bomber fleet. That's a bit of a wake up call for a lot of people. And of course, even with the Iranian war now, we're seeing, you can take out two, three, four, 500 drones and dozens upon dozens of ballistic missiles, but you only really need a small handful to get through to cause some serious economic and serious capability damage to a military. It is one of those concepts that is obviously, and obviously you can't prevent everything.
What does the
Nobody is
future of
trying.
warfare actually look like in a world where everyone is just operating decentralized drone fleets that just appear and disappear out of submarines and tankers? And they're, I mean, not that's Iran's modality. It's Russia's modality, and it appears to be a working one.
It becomes a very, like you said, decentralized environment where you're primarily operating with lighter, decentralized forces who are primarily on the move, who they aren't sticking around in one location very long. They're operating almost in an independent nature among themselves. And of course, that's just the nature of warfare that we're seeing because, of course, we're in an era now where everything is data driven, everything is networked together, and it's very, very hard to hide in the modern battle space. It is very, very hard to keep yourself alive if you aren't moving in the modern battle. And drones are a consequence of that, but they're part of a much broader, much bigger shift that we're seeing to network warfare, where even our adversaries, we can go in and talk about, how even middle powers and some adversarial powers that we might contend with, who might not be on the stage of Russia or China, but could still pose a very significant threat to us and pose a very significant threat to our economic security, our political security, because systems are becoming cheaper to operate, they're becoming more accessible, they're becoming more in demand. It's technology is advancing to the point where almost anyone could hypothetically create a very effective small drone force with very minimal time and very minimal equipment, and that is what is
Then
the
why hasn't
primary.
Canada?
Well, because our system kind of sucks when
Yeah,
it comes to procuring this kind of. And here's the thing: we actually do have a small drone initiative. It is called Minerva, and Minerva aims to acquire a whole bunch of Group One. And for those who don't know, Group One UAS are the very small UAS. I'm not going to get into technical terms because somebody's going to message me and scream at me. That doesn't count. But I'm going to explain it in a simple sentence. The Group One UAS are things like quadcopters or things like FPV drones. They're very small, lightweight drones. We want to procure thousands upon them. We really do. And we tried. We actually tried 2 years ago, and that was called GPUAS. And that completely bombed. That failed completely because it just wasn't a good system and it wasn't properly set up to deal with the current environment. Of course, you procure in the environment that you had set up for you. So Minerva wants to do that. Minerva wants to procure a whole bunch of, small Group One UAS and UGVs and USVs and whatnot. Um, I don't necessarily think they're going to be as successful as they want from a personal standpoint. Anybody who wants to hear me rant about Minerva, I wrote about 4,000 words on Minerva a couple months ago, but we do have plans. The plans do exist, but they're just not necessarily at a stage where we're ready to undertake the kind of things we see the Ukrainians do, for example, where they've kind of created this entire industry of small UAS shops. And, we're talking about people in their basements. We're talking about small factories. We're talking about just places filled with 3D printers and additive
Just a
manufacturing. That's
highly militarily industrialized society. And people
exactly.
don't
And we are
necessarily understand what that means for society.
no, and we're not going to see that in my lifetime probably.
I hope
But
not.
and we shouldn't expect. And this is the thing I tell people: we shouldn't necessarily look at Ukraine and say, okay, we have to copy that. We have to create a system that works for us. And of course, we can look at what Ukraine's doing as an example, and we can even look at what our adversaries are doing, and we can take lessons. But we have to make sure that we're not essentially trying to copy them because their
Right.
environment and their conditions and what they're willing to do is far different from what we're willing.
In that
So it
case,
always
what do you think the biggest lesson Canada can learn from Iran is, and how to counter the United States?
if we're looking at what the Iranians have been doing, what we look at is there needs to be a credible way to successfully target high value infrastructure, obviously. And we're talking from the Iranian perspective, and they've worked to do that. No, their method is primarily employing drones and ballistic missiles to target high value infrastructure. That's how they've hit most of the things, and and to their credit, they have managed to do some nice damage, I'm going to say, in several key regards. Of course, most people are going to focus on the aircraft. I'm going to say, hitting the FPS 132 radar system in Qatar is a pretty
They took
fucking.
out an entire Amazon Web Services instance. Like, the whole Bahrain data center is gone.
I mean, that's what I mean. Like, and that's also the thing we also have to ask ourselves. It's like, how far does like a country like Canada go to protect our civilian infrastructure? It's not just about protecting air bases. We're talking about energy infrastructure, data centers, ports, airports. Rail lines. If you really want to get down the
None of
list of
this is
what should we
hardened in
protect,
Canada. Like, it's all
none.
vulnerable here.
And when it comes to certain things, like I'll always take the opportunity to complain about our rail network. If it comes down to our rail network, we've actually shrunk our rail network significantly over the last 20 years as the two primary rail operators have decided that they no longer need lines and we're perfectly fine with them shutting them down and transferring them into trails
And
and
that
stuff.
has impacts
And
for moving military infrastructure across the country, say, in the case
like
of an invasion.
I'm in for people who don't know, I'm in Sudbury. The line between Sudbury and Ottawa, as example, completely ripped up. Doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. The only access to the Mackenzie River from rail, which is the rail that goes up the Hay River. And keep in mind, the Mackenzie River is one of the vital waterways of the Arctic. It is a highly viable tool for the calf to move supplies across during the barge season. That rail line suffered a fire a couple years ago, and CN has just decided to completely abandon it, which completely cuts off a large part of the Arctic communities that rely on the barge season and on the sea lift from being able to access reliable rail connection. And that's just one of the things. Of course, and a cheap drone, you know, a couple cheap drones can easily disable networks for a significant amount of times, depending on where they are. Especially again, if you're in a situation where you don't have any sort of available redundancy in your entire network. Like, sure, in Southern Ontario, it's different because there's multiple lines and such. But if you come up here, for example, up here in the beautiful Northern Ontario, there's not really infrastructure here by rail to necessarily deal with damage in the long term, especially against an adversary who might be very committed. And of course, that gets back to counter unmanned systems, where it's like, how far do we go with CUAS protection to ensure that we have a fortified, hardened society that can survive potential adversarial targeting. And it's not just drones either. I'll also throw another thing about Iran is obviously mines. And mines are absolutely the most terrifying thing, in my opinion, compared to drones. Mines, and when it comes to Canada, mines actually terrify me more than drones do, in a sense. But that's a different conversation entirely.
Do you think we'll be mining the St. Lawrence River anytime soon?
Oh, mines are. I think like when people think about like naval mines, they're thinking about like the old, the old World War II style,
Yeah, you
like
think of the
naval.
one, the ball with the spikes, like you see in a
Like,
cartoon.
and the Iranians have employed those because they basically just hold on to everything and anything. They're cheap and such. But when we're talking
I
like
mean, isn't
when we
half their air force, their manned jets, are like random Sukhoi jets that they've just held over for decades?
we're just holding we don't talk about the Indian Air Force. But like modern naval mines are absolutely terrifying because they're going to be lurking. And for Canada especially, I don't think people really understand until you like point it out to them that Canada is a nation of choke points maritime wise. Like if you're going to say Vancouver, the port of Vancouver, you're going to be passing through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. If you're going, you're going to have to go through the St. Lawrence. You're going to have to go through the Cabot Strait, and these areas are highly susceptible to mining. And in modern day context, all it really takes is a 20-foot container with say 2 or 3 dozen mines. You can put that onto a small vessel or a cargo ship, and you could just drop them anywhere. And
Right.
for the cap,
And then no
it's
one's
almost
going to
and it's
actually send a boat through because no one wants to. Because, yeah, you might clear the mines after sending 2 or 3 boats to die, but no one's going to do that.
and like if you're talking like from a CAF perspective, you're talking from a military perspective, you've got to ask yourself, well, how do I know that in any sort of conflict, any sort of cargo vessel isn't carrying something that's going to hurt? And
Hmm.
in any case, you just kind of have to accept that risk because there's no real way that you can necessarily, go onto every ship, for example, and inspect everything before it comes into your territorial waters. That's just impossible.
And
And
thankfully,
because
most global interactions are not in the context of someone doing every single thing possible to kill you.
exactly, we're lucky in this case that we aren't, but our adversaries are certainly thinking of these methods on how to hurt us at home. Because, like for the Iranians, it's not about defeating somebody; it's just about raising the cost so high that you no longer
Right.
want to fight that conflict. And in our case, for Canada especially, and if an adversary wants to hurt us, it can be done very quickly, very easily, without them ever really needing to even be here. We're talking, and of course, there is the threat, of course, of things like ballistic missiles, you know, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles. That's all there. And that is all things that we obviously have to prepare for because our adversaries would employ those methods against us if they deemed it, worthwhile. However, it only really takes in the modern context if I'm an adversary state like a China or something, and I'm saying, I want to potentially target something in Canada, it doesn't take a lot of resources to say, procure a couple 3D printers and commercial parts and create some really, really cheap, one-way small drones, put them in the back of a semi truck and drive to some facility or drive to somewhere that is completely vulnerable. Again, we're talking people will focus on things like ports and airfields and all that, but there's also like I said, you could go to a place like a Bruce Power, you can go to a Darlington, you can
Right.
go
Make sure not to
to
give anyone an instruction manual here.
I'm not. No, no. None of you
I,
better cite me, and none of you
but you're
better
just
cite
pointing
me
out how
in the
easy it is, and that
it
honestly, it reflects well on society that no one's really done this yet in Canada.
exactly. We haven't. Nobody's done it. If you cite me in your manifesto for why you decided to bomb Darlington with a
Noah
bunch of
Gairn
small
went
drones,
on It's Getting Pretty Late with Jake Landau and said I could make a terror
I,
cell all by myself in my
uh,
bedroom.
none of you better quote me in your. None of you, that never happened. All I'm saying is that it's possible that that could be a thing,
And it's a
and if you
possibility that needs to be addressed.
and it's something that needs to be addressed. And when we're talking about the Iran, especially, one thing also I would want to throw out there is you have to expect in any sort of serious conflict that you are going to lose assets. You are going to take losses no matter what you do. That's kind of a thing that quite a few people I feel, especially people who might not be in the defense space, have kind of forgotten is
So
that
make
there's
sure
nothing that
they're
is
assets that you're okay losing.
exactly, and that's why
Yeah.
we talk about things like the 80%, and that's what you might hear it sometimes, but that's why when I talk and whenever people talk, you might hear something called the 80%. And the 80% is basically, do we need 100% solution or are we fine with an 80% solution that is scalable, that's replaceable, that can easily be, come in and something that isn't necessarily going to have years long bottlenecks
You don't
for
want the
production.
best jet. You want the jet that you can make a lot out of.
And you mix in the 100% and the 80% where it makes sense with
Right.
each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
But it also depends on like what you want. Like if we're talking like say tanks, obviously for people who don't know, Canada has a tank replacement on the books. It's called heavy direct fire modernization because Canada's current Leo fleet is out very outdated in many cases. There is an upgrade program ongoing right now for some of them, but we're looking for a replacement in the couple years. We have to ask ourselves, what does an actual replacement look like? What does the future of, say, a tank really look like? Is it going to
That's a whole topic for another time.
That is a whole topic where we can get in, and people get very passionate. Believe me, I've been yelled at many, many times over. But it is something that you got to think
Right.
about in the
Yeah.
context of
And we will have many more conversations about that in the future. But, and yeah, the future of drone warfare and counter drone warfare is obviously continuing to develop. And I'm sure we'll have you on and again in the future to talk about even more military and defense industry developments. So, no, thank you once again for coming on the show, and it has been a pleasure to have you.
And thank you, as always, for having me on my favorite podcast. Everybody should always listen to Jake Landau's podcast, and everybody
Yeah, you
should
didn't
obviously
remember the
go.
name there, but that's okay.
I'm tired, okay?
I think
I am
the
very.
name of the podcast is literally "It's Getting Pretty Late
Oh
with
my
Jake
God,
Landau."
it's
My
getting
site
pretty
is
freaking
Jake
late.
Landau is getting tired. You are
I know.
anyways.
I'm sorry.
Well,
And you
well,
remembered my name. Now I feel
we'll
bad.
wrap things up. This is Noah Gairn, everybody, defense analyst for the True North Strategic Review. And that'll do it for this week's episode. Thank you for listening, everybody. You can catch the next episode the same place you caught this one, wherever you get your podcasts. And we will see you next Sunday. Cheers. This is the end of the show. Bye.